to our website for member access. The Q&A session will not be recorded for confidentiality concerns. Throughout the session, if you have any questions, please leave them in the chat box. We will monitor and collect them for discussion in the Q&A session. And tonight's session will be moderated by our charming Vice President of NAP Detroit, Dr. AJ. And we're thrilled to introduce you our three fabulous panelists, Liz, Francis, and Ron. I'm sure most of you have had a chance to glance through their bio before the session, but just the highlight here, Liz Kleinrock, who goes by she, her, and hers, is an anti-bias, anti-racist educator of both children and adults. Her TED Talk in 2019, titled How to Teach Kids to Talk About Taboo Topics, was viewed more than 2 million times. And recently, she's working on publishing her first book. Francis Kai-Hua Won is a journalist, essayist, speaker, activist, and poet who focus on issues of diversity, race, culture, and arts. She is a 2019 Knight Arts Challenge Detroit winner. You can see she has received a lot of awards in the past as well. And, you know, like a key Center for Civil Rights Detroit Equity Action Lab Race, Justice Reporting Fellow on Arts and Culture, and etc. Ronald, oh, sorry. Are you still, oh, okay. Are you seeing Ron's slide right now? Cool. Yeah. Cool. Ronald A. Aramaki is a third-generation Japanese American. He first learned about the internment of Japanese Americans while in high school in Salt Lake City, which sparked his involvement in community activism. He's been co-instructor of University of Michigan's course, Asian Pacific Islander American History and Civil Rights, since 1995. He teaches the internment of Japanese Americans and the lessons of historical current racism. Without further ado, AJ, please take away.
Thank you so much, Yahang. Yahang is our Director of Programs and Events, and she does an amazing job with all of us. And I'm so excited to be moderating this conversation for all of us today. Just a few things. As we talk about these sensitive topics, I do want everybody to understand that this is a safe space, no judgments, and we are coming in here from the perspective of parents, educators, and people who are just involved in the caregiving and upbringing of children and young adults. And so we're here to learn together as a community. And that's just sort of the baseline that I want to establish for all of us. Given that, you know, what I want to do is, Yahang read these amazing bios. And of course, I've had the time to do my research on all three of our panelists tonight. What I want to start off with is, and this is for each of the three panelists, Liz, Francis, and Ron. Given your experience in the space, as educators, as parents, as people who communicate or teach others how to communicate with children, how should we even start thinking about sensitive conversations, given that we've been 2020'd in so many ways? And we can start off with any of the three of you who's ready. I can pick, up to you.
So the question is, how do we begin to talk to our children about race?
How do we begin to, yeah, how do we begin to even think about talking to our kids about these sensitive topics?
Okay, because see, I don't understand why it's being framed as a sensitive topic. I think it's just something we talk about with our kids, right? This is something that's an important part of our experience in America, and it's an important part of their experience in America. And, you know, we talk to them about it. We have to talk, and we have to start early too, because children can experience racism as early as 3 years old, as soon as they hit preschool. Younger than that, they're they're just little babies. So but at 3, for sure, you have to start talking to them, and you talk to them in age appropriate ways, and you start building you don't have obvious, when you're talking about age appropriate, you start, in small ways. So for example, you buy dolls of every color and you show them they're different, and and everyone is beautiful and everyone is smart, especially for girls. You don't want to just focus in on, oh, you're so cute, you're so beautiful. You're beautiful and smart. And boys are, smart and strong and sensitive, and all the qualities that we want to encourage in our children. That's what we tell them. I mean, I don't think race is so different than all the usual things that we talk to them about. But I think people forget to talk about it. And if we forget to talk about it, then the rest of mainstream society will fill in the gaps. And that's where the danger lies. So we want to we want to immunize our children before that stuff hits, before society hits, so to speak.
Ron, Liz?
Yeah, I'll say something. I think it's important for us as parents and as Asian Pacific Islander Americans just to be aware of the fact that we are a particular race or a particular culture, that we live, that we exist, that we exude. So part of what our children learn from us is who we are in terms of how we accept our own selves as a culture, as a person. How do we, do they have grandparents that their parents interact with? So it's I agree with Francis in the sense that it should not be a sensitive conversation. It should be a necessary conversation. And I think that it's age appropriate, but there are some things that you if you reveal things about yourself, then you show us a sense of sensitivity and of vulnerability that creates a sense of trust from your children. And that just makes it more of a natural conversation that you have. And it has to be, it's not something that you have at the dinner table every day. Well, what's the origin of our name, our last name? Where do you think it comes? It shouldn't be very artificial or stilted. But I think that the more it's discussed with things that come around, then I think it becomes more of a natural point of conversation and interaction. I think the interaction is really the more important part of it, rather than just the conversation.
So to build off of what Ron and Francis shared, I do think that before even engaging with children, adults, if you are a parent or a caregiver or an educator, you have to start with the self-work. You have to start with your own identity and understanding who you are and where you come from, and thinking about your intentionality as you are talking with youth, particularly with young children. Like, what are your objectives for that conversation? Like, what do you really want them to walk away knowing and understanding? Because if you don't know who you are, then it's really hard to have the conversation about, who our family is and who our kids are and what direction we're going in. Like, what are we working towards? What do we want? There are a number of things as an Asian American woman who's also adopted into a white family that I never knew about myself or my own history growing up. I can't recall a single Asian American person who was represented in my curriculum, and I went to a fairly elitist prep school. If anything, we learned about the internment of Japanese citizens and Chinese Exclusion Act, very brief things, both under the lens of white colonizer oppressive lens, which doesn't really elicit a lot of pride or joy in wanting to identify with the label of Asian American. So I think parents and adults who are working with kids in any capacity need to think about how they understand themselves, their own comfort levels, to start to think about and prepare for how am I going to answer those really uncomfortable questions that kids always ask. Like if you're in the grocery store and your kid points out somebody who's very dark skinned and asks very publicly, you know, why does this person look different? How are you going to be able to respond to that? So to make sure that you're also doing your research and like child development, the things that Frances was mentioning, like understanding what kids begin to notice at certain ages to set you up for success.
Absolutely. And, you know, that actually brings up a really important point, which I want to start off with Liz and also open up to Frances and Ron. Given what you have said about, you know, the fact that it should not be a sensitive topic, but, you know, Ron and Frances, and all three of you said that about you know, about having these conversations, but then Liz, you brought up the point of doing the self-work. How do we, as Asian American parents or educators in the space, start to dismantle our own model minority myth to get to that point? Because it really is, I don't even like calling it a double-edged sword. It's not. I don't see too many benefits to it, but I see so many cons. But that could be me personally, you know? But how do we begin to dismantle these myths that we've internalized through our colonial history and really start to do justice to the conversation of who we are as Asian Americans in the greater dialogue in this society?
Does it matter who starts or anything?
Yeah, Liz, I'd love for you to,
Oh, okay.
you know, just to kind of go off of what you just said and to tie into this. And then I'd love to hear Frances and Ron's opinions on this too.
Sure. I mean, I was laughing as you asked the question because it's a lifelong process. You know, I don't think you'll ever reach a point where like I'm arrived, like I have like indigenized my mind, you know, getting rid of all of like the colonized aspects of it. And I can only again like speak from my experience, but as like an Asian person raised in a white family and a white community, the only representations I had like growing up as a kid in like the 90s and early 2000s were extremely limited and were deeply based in stereotypes. So part of like dismantling my own like inner model minority myth is trying to reflect on the representations that were presented to me as a kid and what I picked up on. And I have to say, like, the lack of representation, like, really did a number on me. And I think that's where, like, a lot of people of color experience imposter syndrome that manifests itself in really different ways. But when you have, like, one very narrow version of somebody who looks like you, and that's the only version of you you see in movies or in TV and books, and you don't fit into that one image, like, that is where, like, our imposter syndrome comes from. We believe that we're the monolith when really that's, like, the farthest thing from the truth. And so like that's where a lot of that work starts. It's been a lot of like self-education, like reading up on Asian American history, not just like the history of countries in the Asian continent, but specifically Asian American history. And I've gone through a lot of cycles of feeling incredibly erased and very angry at my teachers and my schools that I had to do all of this work in my own time, that I had to seek it out myself to be educated about my people, my ancestors, and where I came from. And this legacy that is just so beautiful and powerful. And I wonder deeply what I would be like now if I had had that type of representation, if I knew that people like Yuri Kuchiyama and Grace Lee Boggs and Fred Korematsu like existed as a kid. How would I be different now? I don't know if that answered your question, but yeah.
Sorry, I was muted. Yes, it did. I did not realize I was muted until now. I muted myself. Frances, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, I think if you, again, I second everything Liz just said, right? You learn your history, you learn Asian American history. If it's easier for you, you start with what's close. You learn about Chinese American history, Chinese culture, Chinese language, and that's for me. And then you extend. So you add on Japanese American culture, Korean American culture, South Asian cultures, and then you extend again, Latinos, African Americans, and slowly, and then not just American experience, but say the Asian British experience and the Asian Australian experience. And then you slowly kind of build up and you see, and you begin to see the similarities. And you also see, I guess when you see the history, you see how things were constructed and how you were in a way brainwashed to believe certain things. And you need to deconstruct that brainwashing. So for example, some of us grew up on Disney films, right? And the handsome prince always looks a certain way. And that's brainwashing, right? From since we were little babies. And so you need to deconstruct that brainwashing. And then you think, well, that's the easy part. We're just talking Disney films. What about everything else? And so like the model minority myth, and I always say myth so people remember it's a myth. The model minority myth was intentionally created in the 1960s to drive a wedge between all communities of color, right? It was intentional.
Yeah.
And so when we buy into it, we're causing harm to other communities. And also it's hard. I mean, the model minority myth is nice to believe. It's all, this whole pull yourself up by your bootstrap thing. It's the American dream. Everyone wants to believe that they did everything for themselves. But once you start, then you start talking about privilege. Think about all the ways you're privileged. And every time I do this experiment with students, for example, I come up with more ways that I'm privileged that I didn't think of the time before.
Yeah.
Like you started with the obvious ones. You're a citizen. Well, anyways, I don't want to get too involved, but the more you think about privilege every day, it's like, wow, you can get. Then you see how that model minority myth was perpetuated.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Ron, do you have anything to add to that?
I agree with Liz. It's a long, drawn out process,
Mm-hmm.
and it's rife with a lot of pitfalls. But I think that to sort of get to the heart of things, the most difficult conversation to have with yourself or with other people is the topic of racism. And I think that's and unless we understand that things are derived from racism and where that comes from, then it's hard to be able to look at ourselves to do any more research on that.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we all, we can all look at ourselves. We all have elements of racism. If you came from a different country, what was it like for you? Were you privileged because you had lighter skin than someone else? Were you privileged because you were more educated and they were not? Were you privileged because you were Japanese and not Korean? And so I think it's also looking at our own roots, whether we've been here in the United States forever, we were born here. A lot of us have been here for a while, but we also have connections with other countries. And so looking at those kinds of things really is the tough conversation or dialogue to have with yourself. And then I think once you're able to look at that, then you can start to open up your mind and say, yeah, let me look at things. Let me find out more about, why am I being held back? What's the difference between me and my colleague who somehow managed to get that promotion and I did not? And so I think those are the kinds of, and it becomes a matter of self-awareness at some point. I remember that when I was a kid, my dad was in Korea. He was in the U.S. Army, and he was stationed back to Korea after we'd come back to the United States. And so my uncle carved me a wooden rifle. And so I went around playing with it, and I'm going, bombs over Tokyo, kill the Japs, kill the Japs. My mom said, you can't say that. I go, why not? Because you're Japanese. Well, I didn't know that because I was immersed in John Wayne movies, World War II movies, and all the heroes were the white guys.
No.
And it took me until I was a teenager to realize that my real hero was Bruce Lee.
Yeah.
So I think that's a very long journey, but it's also very difficult. But I think that's the kind of commitment that we have to have. And once we have that, then the first question about how do we engage in a dialogue with our children, then it becomes something that we can really be able to talk about.
Yeah. That was really That was
Can I-
profound. Go ahead,
Can I add on
Francis.
just one little thing? I also think that as our children grow older and we get to talk to them more and more about age appropriate things, we learn a lot from our children. And so we continue this process and we learn a lot from our children, sometimes from the logical consequences of what we taught them earlier. That's a very humbling experience. But yeah, I would add on the children as well.
Absolutely. Liz, Ron, anything else to add to that?
Well, I had my turn. My child is grown,
Okay.
and my stepchildren are also grown. But when I was teaching the class early on, my son was still in high school, and it was just the two of us. You know, his mother had died a few years ago, and so I said, you know, you need to come to my class. Why? Because I'm teaching this segment about Japanese American history. You know, your mother was Chinese, but your father is Japanese, and you need to know this. And so reluctantly, I dragged him to our class. And he sat in the back of the room and played a Sega game for the whole hour and a half. And I was just bitterly disappointed. Oh my God, you know, here I am, I'm the instructor, and my son, you know, is goofing off. Until a week later, he asked me this question about the internment camps. And I said, you were listening? He says, of course I was.
Right.
And so, you know, there's a moment when you don't trust your children, but then there's a moment when you do trust your child, and then it becomes, well, they can teach you something.
Yeah.
So there's that to add as well.
Absolutely. I mean, for me, having a 4-year-old, these are all profound lessons that I'm already going to carry forward. And I definitely want to get back to that piece of self-awareness. One thing I do want to let all of our members who are on this call know is that if you have questions for Liz, Ron, or Francis, please put them in the chat and we will get to them either through the course of this conversation or at the end of you know, during the Q&A session. But if you have questions that are coming up now, please don't hesitate to put them in the chat. But like I said, I want to get back to that self-awareness. But one of the questions that we had as a team, and all three of you have answered it on a high level in 3 different ways. But if we could get some more specifics on it from all three of you, Liz, Ron, and Francis, especially given that most of the history that our kids learn in schools here in America is whitewashed and written by the victors, so to speak. How do we bring in like our different cultural perspectives of the same events without confusing them or hurting them in their formal education, but still honoring our cultural heritage and breaking free of these myths and stereotypes?
Yeah.
I would say you co-opt those school opportunities. If, for example, my daughter in 1st grade, she had to write a report about a chess champion, right? They gave her a list of chess champions, they're all old white guys, right? And she said, I want to do a Chinese girl who's a chess champion. So we had to do extra work to find the information, but we found it. She did the report on a Chinese girl chess champion, right? And then every, you know, school, they all have those, you know, what are those? The different days that people want to celebrate. You have to go and volunteer in your school. If they're going to do a Valentine's Day celebration, you know, that's very close to Lunar New Year. Sometimes you can squeeze in and co-opt that, that event without imposing too much on the teachers. I know teachers don't like to have too many parties all the time, but find the autumn, like at our school, they don't celebrate, our elementary school, they don't celebrate like Halloween anymore because it's Christians, it's too Christian, or Christians don't like it. So instead they do a harvest festival. Well, harvest festival is a great time to bring in Diwali, bring in the Moon Festival, bring in Chuseok. All those can, so, but you have to find the opportunities and you have to volunteer for the teacher and find ways to bring your stuff into it. And it's more work as a parent, but it will also put you in good stead with the teachers and the principals. The more you volunteer, this is like a safety net. When trouble comes later on, they already know you. And so if you give your advice and your opinion, well, they already trust you, as opposed to being someone they've never seen before who says, there's a problem. I found that that really works. So that's one idea. I have lots of more. I'll stop talking, but I have lots more.
Liz, Ron?
Yeah. The notion of model minorities come up a few times already. And I think that Francis used the word subvert. And I think that that should be part of our mentality as Asian Americans. We're so diverse. You can't pigeonhole anybody. Even in the same room, there might be you can't say you can't find generalizations. You might find commonalities, which is better. But the point I wanted to make is that you can subvert the educational system by not being a nagging parent, but being on, say, the school board committee, and say, well, let's look at the curriculum. What is involved? What's the mission of the school district? Is it inclusivity? Is it understanding many cultures? And if that's the case, what books do you have that would talk about Chinese exclusion or the World War II concentration camps of Japanese Americans, or bullying as a racist issue? So that's political. And I think that one word that a lot of Asian Americans have a hard time saying is politics. It's like asking the vice president, can you say Black Lives Matter? And he could not. And I think this goes back to what we talked about earlier, is that as Asian Americans, one of the ways that we do buy into the model minority myth is that we say, if we don't speak out, if we don't make waves, then we'll be okay. We'll be safe. We'll make enough money. We'll make enough prestige. We'll get that job as the CEO, and people won't bother us. And I think that's a very difficult path to go to, because it shortchanges ourselves, but it also shortchanges our children, because then we don't empower them, because we are not on the school board to advocate for these changes. So I think, it's another way of using Francis's word of subverting the system.
Absolutely. Liz?
Can you repeat the question just so I make sure that I'm addressing?
Absolutely. So our formal education in schools in America is so whitewashed because history is written by the victors. So how do we explain different cultural perspectives of the same historical incidents, where they learn one thing in school, but our culture tells us something differently? How do we explain it without confusing them, but also ensuring that they learn the truth about certain situations?
Okay, so this is the classroom teacher hat coming on, and I can talk about it also from if you are a parent or a caregiver and you want to become more involved in this. So
I think you're breaking up. Uh-oh.
Uh-oh, we lost her.
Liz?
Yeah, she seems to have lost connection.
Okay.
That if she accesses this again, I'll make sure that she enters.
Okay.
All right. So can I just add in one more thing? Because you're talking about specifics. Another great way is March is Reading Month. Everyone volunteers to go and read a book, right? Well, make sure your book is an Asian American book, right? And also birthday parties, give away books, because if other people are going to harass and bully your kids, that's other people, right? So as well educated as your kid, that's not going to help. So give other people Asian American books for their birthday parties, and then one, you don't have to worry that anyone else is going to give it to them, and two, you educate other people kids, and they really like it because they're like, oh, this story is nothing like I've ever had. And it can either be a cultural one or it can be one set in America. And a lot of times people can find the commonalities, you know, like if the story's about a grandma who doesn't speak English, you don't have to be that particular ethnicity to get that story. A lot of folks have that experience.
Yeah, absolutely. Liz, are you back with us?
I'm not
Oh,
seeing her.
I see her.
Oh, you do see her? Oh.
I do. Uh-oh. Her videos. Oh, she's muted. Are you back with us, Liz?
I hope so. I'm sorry
Yes!
about that. Zoom is just
All right,
freezing.
good.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, I just saw, to get back to our question, and Frances gave another great idea about like the reading and the books, but it's essentially, how do we, you know, obviously we don't want to confuse our kids in this American culture, which is written by the victors and whitewashed, and many things are missed. So how do we balance formal education with our the truth of our cultural history and the truth of the American cultural history, really?
Yeah, okay, so there are a couple of things. Like as a classroom teacher, the first thing that I want to do is make sure that I know who my students are, their identities, their backgrounds, because I also can't validate who they are and make sure that they're seen and represented unless I'm aware of who they are in the classroom. So as a teacher, there's pre-work that I can do in terms of getting to know them and getting to know their families, and understand like their cultural backgrounds, linguistic backgrounds, beliefs, things like that. There are, like, from a very like practical, like nuts and bolts level, like there are some really phenomenal children's publishers these days. Lee and Low is one of my absolute favorites. They do really amazing work in representing a very diverse variety of characters and narratives. They actually do a really lovely job of also vetting their authors. So if you're reading a book about Asian American history, if you're reading a book about, you know, Korean identity, it's going to be written by a Korean author. If you're learning about like Vietnamese American history, it's going to be written by a Vietnamese American author, which I think is fantastic. And if you go on the Lee and Low website, they will organize books by your grade and reading level, as well as topic and culture too. So it's really nice to have that resource. I personally like to do everything from an inquiry-based perspective, meaning that I might have an idea of like what the general umbrella topic is, but based on what I ask my students to gather their prior knowledge and questions that they generate about a topic, they're really going to be the ones to direct how we learn. I think it also kind of prevents me from ever being accused of like indoctrinating students or like standing at the front of the classroom just like pushing my agenda on kids. But it's just like really, really super valuable to make sure that you have a really good baseline of what kids are walking into a conversation about like culture or race or identity. Like when I focus on Asian American history, like we have to be really specific, but the very first time I ever did this lesson, when I asked my kids, just list anything, you know, you can just like shout it out. What do you know about Asian American history? It was a very short conversation, to the point like to generate more on the chart, I just asked them to start listing countries they knew of in Asia. And that was really, really hard for them. And I had a number of Southeast Asian and Korean students in my class and they still didn't know very much. So first of all, I was like, okay, well, I need to backtrack because whatever I thought I was going to plan, clearly I need to switch things up a lot tomorrow and going forward. So those pieces are super important, making sure that you know, you're just being really mindful of whose perspectives are being centered in your classroom. An example I can give of this is all of my knowledge from my experience in K-12 learning about the Vietnam War. Not one text, not one textbook was ever written by somebody who is Vietnamese. Everything I've learned has come from phenomenal Vietnamese American, Southeast Asian American authors that I've all, again, like encountered in adulthood and gathered those perspectives to build my own understanding. And now, you know, the way that you view movies like, you know, Forrest Gump or like Platoon and things that have like such an immense standing in like American pop culture history are so deeply problematic when you start to think about those perspectives and who is being centered and who is being erased. Sorry, I got off the tangent of classroom pieces, but if you are a parent or a caregiver and you want to advocate for your kid and your culture and your identity, I think coalition building is going to be like your greatest tool. If you can find other parents who have similar perspectives. If you can identify teachers or staff member or faculty in your kid's school who also believe in this, and if your administration, I guess, is more resistant to form that coalition and come presented with the united front rather than just being seen as like, that one, complaining parent who shows up in the office to like, voice their, whatever's going on or whatever they think. Because I do think at the end of the day, like, we want to center our students and we want to make sure that our kids are seen and heard and validated. But I think when you come from a place of coalitions and like community work, it's going to land very differently than if you come at it by yourself. Because it's not just about Asian American history. Like, we want to make sure that like Latinx history is represented, Indigenous history, Black history, and all of those things need to be seen interwoven together, because again, that's where like the model minority myth becomes problematic, when we have no history of Asian folks and Black folks and Indigenous folks, and like thinking about how like the Brown Berets and the Yellow Power movement and the Black Power movement like so closely work together. Like, we don't hear those stories in history. And we have to think about why those have intentionally been erased, because it's detrimental to white dominance and white supremacist culture to see communities of color working together.
Absolutely. And that actually brings up a question that is coming up in the chat that I think, given what we're talking about, it makes sense to address it now, is that, given that Black Lives Matter has become a national conversation, and given that racism has become a national conversation, what I want to talk about is, given all of that, how do we help our children of different ages, and please feel free to take your time, with the different ages, but how do we help our children, especially coming in as overall populations that join the conversation later for the majority of the, our history of it, but how do we help our children understand another POC perspective, another community of color perspective, when we're still grappling with our own community?
I think if you're talking about different age groups, right? You start, that's the advantage of having your own kids. You start young and you learn with them as you go. Start with children's books. Go to story time at the library. If in your community there's a really good African-American storyteller, make sure you go and hear him tell stories, right? Go to the Juneteenth celebrations, go to the Russian festivals and the Greek festivals, and try to let them experience other communities of color and those cultures as if it were normal, because they are normal, right? And in a way, you're kind of slowly brainwashing your kids to another narrative, right? Whatever your family narrative is going to be, or your community narrative. So like my children, when they were little, they would meet random kids at the park and they would say, oh, we speak 2 languages. How many languages do you speak? And the kid would say, oh, I speak Spanish and English. And then they look, the next kid would say, oh, I speak Korean and English. And everyone spoke another language, right? And they thought that was normal, right? And and I think there's a lot of ways you can do that. Am I still here?
Yes.
Oh, okay, my screen is doing things. And so, what else? I lost my train of thought, sorry.
Everything that it was normal with the multiple languages.
Oh, right. So you start brainwashing your kids, right, when they're little. I mean, in a good way, right? You cultivate friendships where the families are cool, and so like, I mean, when they're little, it's very easy. When they get, and then you're creating your children's characters, and then when they're older, these conversations come up and they begin to see more clearly, right? And the question, they become more age appropriate at some point. You need to have the harder conversations, but and sometimes younger than you expect, right? But if you are reading, say, media of ethnic media, and you are learning from other communities of color, then that's a good, I want to say, a learning tool for us as parents as to what sort of conversations we need to have. Does that make sense? So like in 8th grade, for example, I know that my daughter's school, they taught all the girls, when you go to a party, make sure you cover your drink. Don't let boys put, drugs in your drink, right? This is a lesson they taught in 8th grade. I'm like, oh my God, 8th grade. But then I knew there were other things that I needed to teach them at 8th grade, right? When Tamir Rice was killed, he's 12 years old. My boy was 12 years old, right? We had a very serious conversation. After George Zimmerman was acquitted for Trayvon Martin, we had a very serious conversation about how do you deal with police. And now my boy is 16, he's about to start driving. And it's like, okay, this is how if you get pulled over, this is what you do. And certainly I never had that conversation. I didn't know. And so you can just kind of step by step, this is how you can think of it procedurally. Or if you're nervous about it, think about other things that you want to teach them. How do you teach them about your religion? How do you teach, girls about protecting themselves from, from being taken advantage of? How do you protect boys from, whatever other, because there are a lot of benign conversations. We teach our kids things every day, and just apply those same lessons to this as well.
Okay. Liz?
I don't want to repeat what other people have said. I mean, there's been so much great stuff. I think like when teaching kids about people who are different from them, and I kind of mentioned this before, but making sure that you're starting with positive identity. I've talked to a lot of teachers, like particularly around like Black Lives Matter and making sure that like Black history is represented in schools. But solely focusing on like enslavement and Jim Crow and Black history is not representative. Like nobody, I think, really wants to be defined by like the worst thing that like white people have done to them. Like that's
Right.
not very fun. But before you even get into the conversations about, what is racism, how have people experienced injustice, do children have like a solid sense of like positive self? I guess that was redundant. Are children and students developing a positive self-identity first? So before you introduce all the different ways, or before they begin to experience all the different ways that the world might be stacked against them, do they have enough understanding of who they are and where they come from, where if somebody says something about, their name or their food, yeah, it'll hurt, but they also feel confident enough in who they are to say, you know what, like, that was really mean, that was really rude, like I happen to really like who I am, I really happen to like this food and like what my family does and how I speak and what my parents named me. And I think starting from that place is going to have a very different effect than rather just like people are different and some people like really hate other people just based on like superficial reasons.
Absolutely. And I'm going to get back to that and tie it to that earlier point about self-awareness as soon as but I first want to ask Ron about this idea of how do we address this with our children?
As I said, that ship has left with my son, but I think that we have a lot of opportunities, and I think that everybody gathers around the television to watch TV shows. And I think that we have a lot of opportunities now because there are more families of color that are behaving normally. We don't have the Jeffersons acting like uppity people in New York City anymore. So we have Fresh Off the Boat. We have Modern Family. So we have shows that talk about things about mixed families, gender identity issues and things like that. So I think that's a normal way that you can talk to children about things like that, and it can be a very simple conversation. Yeah. What do you think about that? Mm-hmm. Is that how you see things? Mm-hmm. And I think it's a way to generate, conversations. Well, yeah, it's kind of different to see, two men raising an adopted Asian girl, but it seems okay to me. So I think that we do have opportunities to turn these things into natural conversations.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And so
Oh,
as we,
can I?
oh, go ahead,
Sorry, I
Francis.
always want to
No,
add,
no.
I always come up with things after listening to Ron
Yeah.
and Liz, but like also if you encounter like a racist uncle or a racist experience, make sure you don't just, make sure you talk about it, right? Like sometimes if it's like, say it's Thanksgiving and you have a really racist uncle, you might not be able to do it to his face. It would be great if you could, but you know, sometimes you can't. At least when you get in the car and you're headed home, you start talking about it and say, you know, they said that, but I don't agree. You can make your own choice when you get older, but you know, there are other, you know, however it makes sense for you to talk about, but talk about it instead of just laughing. A lot of times when people tell a racist joke, everyone laughs along politely with it. Well, you know, there's more at stake for, I want to say us, for our families. So you need to say something. And later on, your children can learn, also if that's modeling behavior, your children can
Right.
learn and they can challenge other people as well, you know, in a nice way. I mean, it's not always it's not always going to be bad, but sometimes it's in a nice way.
Absolutely. And so as our last official question before we completely open up to audience, I want to talk about something from all three of you that relates all of these: the modeling, the talking about the racist jokes, the self-awareness and understanding of how our upbringing may be different. You know, so I want to tie all heavy topics. I'm somehow going to tie them into a single question that's going to blow everybody's mind away with your answers. So let's see if we can do this. So, and really, they're all related. So many of us have grown up either in cultures directly because we're first generation immigrants because of our newness, or because we've been imbued those cultures with us of completely different definitions of bullying, of xenophobia. You know, like a lot of what our kids even see as problematic behavior wasn't problematic for previous generations. So given these generational differences, how do we then begin to understand as parents and as educators and as caregivers what the sensitivity of that new generation is, and how to communicate with them in that sensitivity and in the ways in which the world are changing in the definitions of bullying, in the definitions of xenophobia, with the nuances. You know what I mean? Like, as we learn more, our no-nos are expanding. Our problematic behavior is expanding because we realize more of it is problematic. So how do we, as people who model it, keep track of that? And how do we just do justice to our next generations? How do we respond and model responses to racist jokes in a way where our kids actually understand it? Like, how do we actually model?
Is it okay if I start? Or
Yeah,
oh,
go,
never mind.
Liz, go Liz.
Are you sure? I think first, even like, you know, trying to address it when people say, you know, this was a different time, like people just didn't know better, things were different then. I would actually argue against that, because I think by taking that mentality, we also erase the work of people who in that time did know it was wrong and did speak up for it. And not wanting to erase like the efforts and the actions that they took also. I think that we can frame it in terms of like, we have more mainstream visibility on different issues, and people who were previously erased or didn't have a voice now have more visibility, and we are more aware, and we are therefore able to be more respectful and more inclusive. I do understand, like in the world of like anti-bias, anti-racism, like language is constantly changing and evolving. Nobody wants to be like the problematic person, right? I think that there needs to be a lot of space for self-reflection and recognizing that the things that you have been brought up to believe are going to change over time, and to really own that and embrace that. Like nobody is born woke, like no one is born like all knowing, no one comes out the womb like reading Ta-Nehisi Coates books, like that's just not how it works. And being able to model that for kids, like, oh, you know what, I actually used to think this, but then I learned about this, and now I think this instead. And I do that a lot with adults too, particularly adults who are more resistant to, like, you know, introducing yourself and sharing your pronoun, and like why that's important, to say, you know what, like I used to actually never do that or think about that, but then I learned that it's really inclusive of people like across the gender spectrum. So now it's something that I include when I introduce myself and in my email signature, because it opens up the, it gives an invitation for people to also share their pronouns and share their gender identity. But to frame it in a way where you can also model your own evolution and your own thinking, because I think that in a lot of these spaces, when people are deemed like experts in it, we assume that we have to immediately be at the same level of awareness and understanding as everyone else. But, you know, I say I'm an anti-racist educator in progress because I will always be in progress, you know, and being able to model that for people along their journey also, because again, there's no finish line to cross, like it's a spectrum and we're all at a different place.
Absolutely. Francis, Ron, Francis?
I mean, I think we can, it takes work. You have to keep up. You have to keep up with the times. And if you have teenagers, no problem. If you have teenagers, just pay attention. Volunteer for carpool. That's the best secret tip I ever got. Volunteer for carpool, and then you can eavesdrop on all the kids in the back seat talking about the issues that are important to you. You wanted concrete tips, right?
Yeah.
Here they are.
Yep.
So, but talk to your teenagers and talk to your young adults, and you will actually middle schoolers. Oh my God, middle schoolers, they know what's going on and they're quite aware. So talk to them about the issues that are important to them, how they're framing them, and think, because things change. Also, like if you think about just for women in the Me Too movement, so much has changed over these last few years, and I learned so much just by talking to my daughters. In a way that, I mean, it helped me process. I mean, I read a lot and I studied a lot, but then I also talked to my daughters and kind of worked through a lot of issues that I didn't quite agree with and didn't understand. What else? I forgot the other thread I was thinking of. Why don't we go to Ron and I'll come back. I always come back.
Well, Francis, what you said was being a good listener as a parent. And that's a real key thing, because we've always been told, well, our parents have always told us, you know, listen to me, you know, because I know what's right and you don't. And I'm going to say these things to protect you, to make you a better person, so that you can get all A's, you know, and come home with a good report card and make me happy. So we've been inculcated to listen to somebody in authority. But I think your point, Francis, is that we can learn the skill of listening to our children, whether they're 5 or 15 or 35. And I think that creates a moment or an opportunity, not a moment, but an ongoing opportunity to be able to listen to what they're thinking and how they're feeling. And when they know that you're really listening, it allows them to feel more comfortable to listen more. You know, I spent 20 years trying to tell my son how to be a good child, you know, being both father and mother. And I, you know, give him all these tips and, you know, be the sage, parent, Asian American parent. And he would never talk to me about that until 5 years ago. He moved to New York City and he calls me every week. And we talk about stuff, and I'll say, well, when did you learn this? He said, well, you told me this, but it didn't matter until now. And so I think that there's a sense of humility that has to come, that we have to get into, because we've been told our parents know everything, and so we should listen. Now that we're parents, we're going to tell you what we know, so you should listen. And I think it's that humility that allows us to feel like we can have a dialogue, which frees us both up as parents and as children.
Yeah. So,
So,
oh, go ahead,
so
Francis.
just one more piece. I keep doing this. Sorry, Ron. You know, and not just telling them. You have to model the behavior so the kids see, how do you treat elders? How do you treat neighbors? How do you treat strangers? How do you
Right.
treat people that are different from you? And you know, you, because they're your kids as opposed to, you know, strangers, you can stop and explain it also. So, for example, whenever you know, we're all busy, right? But whenever I see an elder, a Chinese elder who's struggling, like in a museum, in a pharmacy, whatever, because they don't speak English, I always stop and I translate, right? And I tell my kids, and they've seen me do it, and now they all do it, that they're older. They always stop, they help people translate, because I'd say, look, my grandmother lives very far away and I cannot be there to help her. But I hope some stranger on the street will stop and help my grandmother translate if she's lost or if she's stuck, or if, you know, and when you can translate, it takes 2 seconds and the whole situation is resolved, right? If otherwise you've got the pharmacist and the old grandpa yelling at each other for 20 minutes over, you know, it's awful. But you model the behavior, and then you explain to the kids, this is what I'm doing, this is why I'm doing, or you give them instructions. If you see anyone picking on one of your friends, bullying them, you step in and you say something. If you can't say something, go get help, go get an adult. If the adult doesn't help, come get me, I will help, you know? So you give them plan A, B, C.
Thank you, Francis. And, you know, it was so interesting to hear from the three of you, being experts in the space, but hearing 3 different perspectives. And for me, the overall kind of messages were, 1, self-awareness, self-education, modeling through our own evolution to our next generation. Then there was from Ron, the active listening and the active kind of participation as an observer, but also a guide from the parents. And then there was modeling and being a proactive volunteer from Francis to really guide our future in the ways that we want to see them guided. And so before I open this up for our audience to ask their questions, the one last thing that, you know, I want to ask you as a moderator, and as sort of your parting statements officially before we stop recording, you know, because dun, 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 that's a big deal, so if you had to leave us with a parting thought of what is your kind of overall final message of, in terms of, and let me frame this really, really, really clearly. What is your hope for us as the AAPI community, that as audience, you think we will learn and that you hope our society is going to get to? What is your hope for our future as Asian Americans? If you can leave us with that message of hope, we'll open it up to the audience.
Okay. Who's going to start?
Go ahead, Ron.
That's a good question. And I think that what I would like to see in terms of hope is that as a group of communities and as individuals of parts of those groups, that we have a sense of compassion born from a sense of experience, that we know what bad things are like because we felt them, and that we have the compassion to understand or to recognize that those things are being done to people who look like us just because we're Asian American, and they don't get the help. But that we have the compassion and the courage to step in and say, you know, I know what you're going through because I've experienced it myself, and with all of us helping each other out, it's not that we're going to avoid that, because that's not going to happen. It's that we are better able to help each other out and deal with it in a, well, I mean, in a positive way, but also in an empowered way, so that we know that we are not going to be mistreated just because people assume that we are a particular way. So, so basically my hope is that we are able to feel empowered ourselves, which gives us the ability to empower other people and pass it on, so to speak, pass it forward.
Absolutely. Liz, Francis, either?
I would say, think of that. I think what another great piece of advice I got was you're not raising children, you're raising adults, right? So think about what kind of people do you want your children to grow up into? What kind of world do you want to create for them? And create that world for them, and give them the tools they need to succeed in that world, right? Or to make that world happen. Give them the tools. Oh my gosh. So so that when they encounter it, they know what to do, right? And like, because certain things are going to happen, start talking to them way ahead of time, so and practice. If you have to practice. One of my daughters and I, we physically practice. If a bully corners you into the wall, this is how you gracefully push him out of the way and sidestep, and like, we physically practice this. And so there are other, how do you speak up? How do you talk to your teachers? All sorts of things. Just you can practice. And if you can't practice, read a lot of stories and books, so that and take media in, so that they get the stories and they get other examples. So I learned a lot when I started reading Asian American literature. It's like, oh, Maxine Hong, like everyone talks, Maxine Hong Kingston, Woman Warriors, the book everyone reads, their first Asian American book that they read. But there's a scene in there when she talks about Chinese school, and I'm like, yes, oh my gosh, I understand this. And when she talks about, how Chinese women are not really quiet, they're actually very loud. I'm like, yeah, how come I didn't realize this, right? And then, so give them the stories. And you can, if you're an adult reading adult books, you can still pick out the stories and retell them to your kids. So I was reading Lois Ann Yamanaka once, and the book was way too mature for the kids, but there was a few cute little stories. And so I would, along the way, so I would tell those stories to my kids, and it was great. So they had these stories of how people dealt with these things. They had examples that they could choose from.
Absolutely, absolutely. Liz?
I would just say that Asian Americans should be loud and unapologetic and take up space, a lot of space. I think some good advice I've been given is when you are empowered, it should empower you to empower other people. And I do think, representation is shifting in a way where I see more Asian representation across the board, which is great. But as Asian Americans, we are a very diverse, very large group, and to recognize even when the term Asian American is being used, who is really being centered in that. I think it's pretty clear that East Asian identities are often the focus, but we can't forget about our Southeast Asian, our South Asian, our West Asian brothers, sisters, siblings. And a big hope of mine also is that Pacific Islanders stop getting lumped into Asian American, because they have their own history of cultures, experiences with colonization that are very different than those of people from countries within the Asian continent, Asian Americans in this country too. So to know who you are, notice when you're showing up, advocate for yourself, and bring others with you.
Absolutely. And just on that, what your last thing you said about the different subsets of Asian Americans, and separating Pacific Islanders and Native Hawaiians and, Polynesians. I feel like, Liz, you and I, we could have a whole 2-hour conversation on that. All of us could. Thank you so much to all three of you, to Ron, to Francis, to Liz, to Mustanzar, to Asim, to Yahang, to everybody involved in this for creating this amazing event where we could have a candid conversation about this. I'm already getting chats about, publishing summaries of this, inviting to participate in future endeavors, and there's a lot of chat happening. So I would like to open it up to our audience members so that they get a chance to get their questions answered by you as well. And rest assured, I will be in touch with all three of you. And I thank you so much for adding your perspectives in today. I know that as a mother of a 4-year-old, I learned. And I know that every single person in our community learned so much from this. So thank you from the bottom of our hearts.
Well, thank you. It's an honor.
And thank you, Ron. And with that, I'm going to start off with the questions. If anybody does have questions, Dr. Jamie Shu, I know you had questions. Please feel free to unmute yourself and ask. But here were a couple of questions that came up earlier. How